Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first talk in our spring lunchtime lecture series. This season, our speakers are exploring the past, present, and future of environmental science. I'm Charlotte Abney Solomon, Assistant Director of the Beckman Center for the History of Chemistry and Kane Research Fellow here at the Science History Institute. It's my honor to introduce our guest for today, Hannah Pell, who will be speaking about the decommissioning process at 3 Mile Island. Before I do, I'll say a little bit about the format of today's lecture. Hannah will speak for about 30 minutes, after which we'll have 15 minutes for audience Q&A. You can send in your questions during the talk using the chat function here on YouTube. You'll just need to log in and we will collect the questions from the chat for the speaker. You can also email us your questions at lunchtimelectures@sciencehistory.org. We do have a two-step spam filter, so if you're emailing us for the first time, you may need to watch your inbox and reply to a verification email. That's lunchtimelectures@sciencehistory.org. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. Hannah Pell is a freelance science writer interested in the energy industry and the history of nuclear power. She holds degrees in physics and music, and she's an alumna of the Fulbright program. She's currently serving on the community advisory panel for the 3 Mile Island Unit 2 decommissioning. Welcome, Hannah. Thank you so much for joining us today to kick off our spring season.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. And yeah, thanks to everyone who's joining us today. I'm so grateful to be here to talk about the past, present, and future of 3 Mile Island, a nuclear plant that is very personal to me, as well as what we can learn from it about the shifting role of nuclear amid Pennsylvania's broader energy transition. On May 30th, 2017, Exelon Corporation, the largest operator of nuclear plants in the United States, announced that 3 Mile Island's operational Unit 1 would be retired before September 30th, 2019, quote, absent needed policy reforms. Notably, in the announcement, Exelon CEO Chris Crane said the following: the Commonwealth has an opportunity to take a leadership role by implementing a policy solution to preserve its nuclear energy facilities and the clean, reliable energy and good-paying jobs they provide. Now, as 3 Mile Island's Unit 2 was permanently damaged from the infamous 1979 partial meltdown, TMI Unit 1 continued to supply reliable electricity to more than 800,000 homes for decades to come. Despite the fact that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission had renewed Unit 1's license to operate until 2034, Exelon decided to shutter the plant 15 years early. So why close, why now, and what comes next? In this talk, I'm going to try to answer these questions. The Energy Information Administration has reported that 2021 is poised to be a record-setting year for the most annual commercial nuclear power plant retirements ever in this country. 5% of the current U.S. nuclear operating capacity, 5.1 gigawatts, is expected to be taken offline. And in fact, Unit 3 at the Indian Point plant in New York is shutting down this week. It's clear that commercial nuclear power is at a crossroads. And I think there's a lot we can learn about this shift by looking at TMI in particular, especially a nuclear plant that has been uniquely and infamously bookended by a permanently damaging accident and premature closure. Additionally, focusing on TMI is a useful lens through which to understand significant economic, legislative, and environmental factors affecting, what happened? Sorry, I can't see my PowerPoint. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. Additionally, focusing on TMI is a useful lens through which to understand significant economic, legislative, and environmental factors affecting nuclear's changing role in Pennsylvania's energy industry. And I aim to emphasize that although premature nuclear closures is emerging as a more national trend, understanding regional factors as well as hidden costs and unintended consequences will be necessary for navigating nuclear's future. Okay, so part one, I will address the 1979 partial meltdown and the community activism that resulted. Part 2, I'll talk about energy markets and the rise of fracking and energy legislation for renewables. And Part 3 will include responses to the potential TMI shutdown and efforts to keep it open. And Part 4 will be about the Unit 1 closure and current plan for decommissioning Unit 2. Okay, so Part 1. Okay, so let's take a step back first. What is 3 Mile Island? So TMI is/was a 2-reactor nuclear power facility located on a 3-mile island, hence the name, in the middle of the Susquehanna River near Middletown, Pennsylvania. Both units are pressurized water reactors, meaning that coolant water is pumped under high pressure through the core, where it's heated by controlled fission of uranium atoms. Unit 1 was commissioned in September 1974 on a 40-year operating license, which was extended in 2009. And Unit 2 was commissioned in December of 1978 after a delayed and over-budget construction, but would only be online for 3 months before the worst nuclear accident in U.S. history would permanently damage the reactor, marking a significant turning point in the industry writ large, especially with regard to safety, emergency planning, and public perception. Okay, so what happened? At 4:00 a.m. on March 28, 1979, several main feed water pumps failed to send water to the steam generators in order to remove heat from the reactor core. The reactor tripped, shutting itself down as it was designed to do. Pressure began to rise, so the pilot-operated relief valve, the PORV, was opened. This valve should have closed when pressure returned to normal levels in the system, but it remained stuck open, eventually leaking more than 8,000 gallons of coolant water. To the operators in the control room, however, the PORV appeared closed, and measuring instruments were sending inaccurate readings to the control room, and alarms were going off, but, quote, not giving us any useful information, according to an operator's later testimony. They took manual control of the water system because they feared the core going solid or having too much water and losing control of pressure. And by around 5 a.m., technicians were monitoring increasing radiation levels. An on-site emergency was declared around 6:30 a.m. The plant remained in crisis for the next several days, and ultimately radiation was purposely leaked in the air to relieve pressure within the system, avoiding the possibility of then suspected but later disproven hydrogen bubble explosion. So especially in the broader context of domestic and international energy crises, the TMI accident shattered initial hopes and promises of nuclear power as a resource too cheap to meter. Mishandled communications by the utility, Metropolitan Edison, has left a long legacy of fear and mistrust for area residents who still today cite the lack of clarity and accessibility to information as one of the most painful aspects of the accident. The presidential committee who investigated it determined that the most serious health effect was, quote, severe mental stress. And miscommunications exacerbated antagonism towards TMI, which has continued for some to this day. After the events at Unit 2, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission had suspended the operating license of Unit 1 until Metropolitan Edison, the utility, could prove that it was safe. Local area residents began coordinating to prevent a restart of Unit 1 and monitor the cleanup operations of Unit 2. One such group was known as the People Against Nuclear Energy, who won a legal victory against the NRC in 1982, ordering the commission to consider local residents' fears as a relevant and significant impact to restarting Unit 1. And residents in 3 neighboring counties, Dauphin, Cumberland, and Lebanon, voted about 2-1 in favor of a non-binding referendum against restarting Unit 1. Ultimately, however, the NRC voted in favor of restarting it in 1985, to much public anger, frustration, and disappointment. The Unit 2 cleanup was not fully completed until 1993, and it has remained in a state of monitored storage since. The TMI accident further catalyzed the growing anti-nuclear movement, sparking local protests and organized activism. The beginning of TMI's life cycle was characterized by this unprecedented nuclear accident that has cast a long shadow over the plant. Its presence is contentious, rooted in this anti-nuclear mobilization as, quote, a majority of residents in this scattering and self-contained and relatively apolitical conservative central Pennsylvania communities were transformed into a loosely knit network of anti-3 Mile Island citizen groups. Although Unit 2 has sat dormant since the accident, TMI has effectively operated at half capacity since Unit 1 was reopened. Public perception of TMI has remained an important factor in understanding its unique position and, I would argue, its closure. Okay, so according to Exelon, one of the principal reasons for their decision to shutter TMI, one, were, quote, flaws in market rules that fail to properly value the resilient zero emissions power provided by the nuclear plant. What are these market rules, and why only in the past few years did they become a significant challenge for 3 Mile Island in particular? When TMI opened in the mid-1970s, utilities in Pennsylvania were vertically integrated, meaning that they controlled the generation, supply, and distribution of power to consumers. Ratepayers had really no choice of where their electricity came from. TMI Units 1 and 2 were then owned by 3 different utilities: Metropolitan Edison, Jersey Central Power and Light, and Pennsylvania Electric. These companies were collectively organized under the General Public Utilities umbrella. In 1996, Pennsylvania legislators passed the Electricity Generation Customer Choice and Competition Act, which would fundamentally restructure how electricity is consumed in Pennsylvania. Legislators argued that Pennsylvania's electricity costs were higher than the national average due to the lack of competition, and the utilities were a bit of a monopoly as they saw it. The legislation reads, because of advances in electric generation technology and federal initiatives to encourage greater competition in the wholesale electric market, it is now in the public interest to permit retail customers to obtain direct access to a competitive generation market, as long as safe and affordable transmission and distribution service is available at all levels of reliability that are currently enjoyed by the citizens and businesses of this Commonwealth. Pennsylvania's in-state electricity market was now effectively deregulated, and today, nearly all electricity production in Pennsylvania is generated by independent power producers. So that's changes in Pennsylvania's in-state energy market. So zooming out a bit, Pennsylvania is also one of 13 states and the District of Columbia in which electricity management is overseen by PJM Interconnection. Now, the PJM Interconnection is responsible for coordinating the movement of electricity throughout this region as a regional transmission organization. In order to do so, PJM holds an annual capacity market auction to guarantee energy generation for the forthcoming years. So the next PJM auction is scheduled for May 19th to ensure that sufficient energy production will be available in 2022 and 2023. 3 Mile Island had been unable to clear the PJM auction since 2014, meaning that TMI's electricity was unable to sell in the PJM market, despite nuclear being listed as the second cheapest energy source after renewables, according to PJM. It's important to note that TMI-1 wasn't the only nuclear plant whose electricity couldn't sell under this system. In fact, Exelon's Byron and Dresden nuclear plants based in Illinois also failed to clear the PJM auction in 2018. So what we've seen is that increased competition in Pennsylvania's deregulated electricity market has indeed driven down electricity prices for consumers over time, which in principle is a good thing. However, as the regional PJM market is currently structured, nuclear is struggling to compete as an economically viable option for future energy needs. And this was a factor in TMI's early closure, according to Exelon. Costs for renewables have significantly decreased, and there are specific Pennsylvania energy policies that have played a role in that I'll explore in a bit. But the disruptive role of another energy source, natural gas, has emerged in recent years, putting Pennsylvania at an energy crossroads. So over the past decade, Pennsylvania has seen a meteoric rise in hydraulic fracturing or fracking, particularly due to the Commonwealth's geographic overlap with Marcellus Shale. In 2019, gas-fired power plants surpassed nuclear power plants as the largest suppliers of in-state energy for the first time. And additionally, Pennsylvania is predicted to provide 40% of the United States total gas production by 2040. Okay, quickly, how does fracking work? A well is drilled deep beneath the Earth's surface as far as 9,000 feet, and a mixture of water and other chemicals is blasted through it to create fractures in the rock that allow oil and gas to flow through the well. Although the fracking method was first conceived in the 1860s, its impact in the last 2 decades is attributed to the more recently developed techniques of horizontal drilling and the surge of natural gas drilling in the Marcellus Shale region since 2008. Such influx of natural gas to the Commonwealth's energy mix has disrupted the PJM electricity market by significantly driving down electricity costs. In their report of the 2018 auction results, PJM specifically cited the low cost of natural gas as a change that impacted the supply curve, quote, which leads to higher capacity market offers from nuclear, among other resources. So although fracking may be cheaper by market standards, increased drilling, there are some environmental risks that are still very much debated, including potential groundwater contamination and methane leaks from uncapped wells. Renewables have also played an increasingly competitive role in Pennsylvania energy markets, in part due to the role of state energy legislation subsidizing them. Exelon's 2017 announcement said that PMI would close, quote, absent needed policy reforms. The press release further noted that despite nuclear providing 93% of the Commonwealth's emission-free electricity and avoiding 37 million tons of carbon emissions, nuclear is not included in the Alternative Energy Portfolio Standard, and amending the AEPS is one of the many potential solutions to preserve Pennsylvania's nuclear plants. Okay, so what is the AEPS? In 2004, the Pennsylvania legislature passed this act, which mandated certain percentages of all electricity sold must have been produced from renewable and environmentally beneficial sources. The AEPS established 2 tiers of these eligible energy sources. Tier 1, at 8%, includes solar, wind, low-impact hydropower, geothermal, biomass, and fuel cells. And Tier 2 includes municipal waste and other non-renewables at 0.5%. The 15-year timeline for companies to reach these standards ends this year, and local environmental groups are calling for updated legislation to increase the percentages outlined in the initial standards. And in fact, legislation was introduced in the State Senate a few weeks ago to amend these percentages. Notably, nuclear power was not included in either tier and therefore has not been benefit from the newly created alternative energy credit system to increase the economic viability of the energy sources included. So despite the fact that 3 Mile Island was operating at half capacity since Unit 1's reopening in 1986, why only in the past few years has the plant been unprofitable and unable to clear the PJM auction? Why did Exelon choose to close now? Nuclear proponents argue that economic and legislative decisions in Pennsylvania, including the PJM energy market and the lack of subsidies for nuclear under the AEPS, have indirectly played a part in TMI Unit 1's premature closure. Meanwhile, the rise of a robust fracking industry in this state means that natural gas is cheap, available, and for some, preferred. These trends over time have not only changed the financial calculus of our energy transition and future, but highlight the fact that with each cost comes another. There are always trade-offs, whether environmental, political, labor, or otherwise. And in 2017, when the potential consequences to nuclear's long-term viability in Pennsylvania became clear, what was done about it? So Exelon's 2017 announcement effectively marked the beginning of the end for TMI. They pointed directly to the legislator to save the plant, which again would close, quote, absent needed policy reforms. So what actions were taken? The same year, in 2017, the Department of Energy proposed to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission a grid resiliency pricing rule. Under the proposal, FERC would, quote, impose rules on commission-approved independent system operators and regional transmission organizations, such as PJM, PJM, to ensure that certain reliability and resilience attributed of electric generation resources are fully valued. The DOE argued that premature power plant retirements, specifically those that can withstand disasters such as coal and nuclear, is becoming an increasing threat to the resiliency of the grid, as well as economic and national security. The fundamental challenge of maintaining a resilient electric grid has not been sufficiently addressed by FERC or the ISOs and RTOs. The continued loss of fuel-secure generation must be stopped, the docket reads. In response, Pennsylvania legislators in both the House and Senate issued resolutions urging FERC to, quote, swiftly consider the U.S. DOE's proposed grid resiliency pricing rule and implement policies to ensure fuel-secure baseload electricity generation resources receive proper compensation. Notably, Pennsylvania ranked third nationally for coal production in 2018 and second for nuclear in 2019. They passed overwhelmingly in both chambers. However, FERC ultimately rejected the proposal, but initiated a new proceeding for PJM to specifically evaluate the resiliency of power generation sources. The case for nuclear would now come down to its reliability and resiliency, especially as extreme weather events, such as the 2014 polar vortex, pose an increasing threat to grid operations. In response to Exelon's announcement to shutter TMI Unit 1, a bicameral, bipartisan, first-of-its-kind nuclear caucus was formed with over 75 members of the Pennsylvania General Assembly for an opportunity to learn about nuclear energy's importance to the Commonwealth's energy portfolio, economy, and environment. The caucus held a series of hearings throughout 2018, receiving testimony from industry executives, experts, and analysts, union leaders, advocacy groups, among others, and parsing through special interests, not excluding their own, to understand the economic, labor, and environmental value of nuclear energy and 3 Mile Island to the region. The Nuclear Caucus report summarizes their findings with regards to economics, labor, and environmental justifications. So regarding economics, the Nuclear Caucus challenges the structure of the PJM market, noting that, quote, low natural gas prices provide short-term gains, which are appreciated, but these prices fail to factor in the larger picture of fuel diversity and long-term carbon emissions reductions. The report continues, we make long-term energy policy decisions based only on what is cheap today, acknowledging the difficulty in reconciling longevity of commercial nuclear power, which are often licensed for decades at a time, with short-term market behavior. Efforts to quantify the effect of nuclear closures on the labor force have resulted in little agreement. The Nuclear Caucus report cited a 2015 study that estimated the nuclear plants in Pennsylvania account for 15,600 in-state direct and secondary full-time jobs. However, the report was requested by Nuclear Matters, a national coalition advocating the benefits of nuclear energy. At the start of one of the hearings, State Senator Ryan Almond asked, if the situation were reversed and we had an opportunity in this Commonwealth to attract 3,000 jobs for a manufacturing facility, could you imagine the effort underway in this building today to put in place economic incentives, tax credits to attract these jobs to Pennsylvania? And third, the report argues nuclear contributes an overwhelming majority to Pennsylvania's zero emissions energy, 93%, preventing harmful emissions compared to the gas and or coal-fired generation that could replace them, which would potentially undo years of climate progress. Additionally, the fact that nuclear plants can run 24/7 for 18 to 24 months without refueling makes it an invaluable contributor to a fuel mix supporting a reliable and resilient grid. In anticipation of TMI-1's potential closure, State Representative Tom Mahaffey sponsored a bill named the Keep Powering Pennsylvania Act that would specifically amend the AEPS that I discussed earlier to include nuclear power as a Tier 3 energy source and correct such market flaws by ensuring that 50% of electricity purchased would come from nuclear power. The markets do not treat all clean sources of energy the same, and they do not penalize polluters, according to Rep. Mahaffey, as he announced the House bill and local ironworkers union hall surrounded by laborers who had contributed to the construction and maintenance of TMI. As state legislators, we need to take a step back, recognize this, and truly take into account the cost of doing nothing. Such cost of doing nothing, according to Mahaffey in a statement, far exceeded the potential cost to consumers. An estimated $788 million annually in higher electricity bills, which would amount to roughly $1.77 more per month per household if TMI would close, versus $500 million to cover the cost of House Bill 11. Additionally, Mahaffey emphasized in a conversation with me that job retention is just as, if not more, important than job creation. Opponents of the bill, including some environmental groups, manufacturers, consumer advocates, and a coalition of special interest groups forming the Citizens Against Nuclear Bailout, view nuclear's lack of market competitiveness as an inevitability and even a positive outcome. We urge Pennsylvania legislators to shift their focus from preserving the aging energy sources of the past and instead look ahead toward real climate solutions that will advance a clean energy future in our Commonwealth, the conservation voters of PA said in a March 2019 press release. Meanwhile, Penn Future, a nonpartisan environmental advocacy group in Harrisburg, published a report estimating the various ways in which Pennsylvania state and local government provided $3.8 billion in fossil fuel subsidies over the course of 2019. House Bill, Rep. Mahaffey's House Bill never made it to the floor for a vote. We, the legislator, let you down, he said. Okay. 3 Mile Island Unit 1 was officially closed on September 20th, 2019. On the day of the closure, Penn Live's Department of Mixed Feelings asked if anyone would miss it. I think for most in the area, it'd be a yes and no. 2019 was also the 40-year anniversary of the Unit 2 accident, and collections of local stories through the I Remember TMI project, among other reporting of the accident, renewed such long-held mixed feelings. For some, the grief of a lost plant, jobs, and characteristic presence in Londonderry Township, a community neighbor. For others, a complicated, divisive, and perhaps untrustworthy industry threatening to the safety, environment, and public health of those around it. In the wake of TMI's closure, many have discussed the potential impact of job losses to the local economy, although such impact still remains unclear in my view. Exelon dedicated 2 paragraphs of its 41-page post-shutdown decommissioning activities report to socioeconomics, noting that, quote, impacts are neither detectable nor destabilizing and that mitigation measures are not warranted as a result of the decreased workforce. At its peak, Exelon employed roughly 675 employees at TMI. However, this number is a minimum and does not include ancillary workers, those in the construction and building trades, for example, nor the additional thousands of annual outage and maintenance workers. Only 50 employees are expected to remain on site by 2022. The Middletown Press and Journal reported that 78 employees lived in the region. TMI employees lived in the region immediately surrounding the plant. Middletown, Royalton, Londonderry Township, and Lower Swatara. So while there is an impact job-wise, it really isn't that deep in our area, they wrote. Although these numbers may seem low relative to the collective population of their surrounding residencies, there are secondary costs consequential to these job losses, such as decreased tax revenue, local spending power, and funding for public and emergency services. Our changing energy sector offers many promises of new, good-paying job creation, but as I mentioned earlier, job retention is and will remain an important factor in managing a just energy transition. In December 2020, Energy Solutions, a nuclear decommissioning and decontamination company, acquired the license for Unit 2 after the Nuclear Regulatory Commission approved the transfer. According to NRC policies, the decommissioning process must be completed within 60 years of initial shutdown. Energy Solutions established a subsidiary company, TMI2 Solutions, and partnered with a general contractor to handle the decommissioning activities. Exelon currently still owns Unit 1, and at this point, the decommissioning plan is not clear, although Exelon and others have noted that it would be efficient to decommission both units together. The decommissioning process is expected to take until 2037, earlier than required and supposedly under budget. TMI2 Solutions' tentative timeline includes several phases. Phase 1A, planning and licensing, Phase 1B, damaged core material removal, Phase 2, decontamination and decommission, and Phase 3, damaged core material storage and transfer. Notably, plans are currently underway to dismantle the iconic cooling towers later this year, which has been framed as non-radiological forward progress. The process is expected to cost $1.06 billion by 2019 estimates. After investigation by the PA Department of Environmental Protection, the current fund in the TMI2 Decommissioning Trust is expected to sufficiently cover this, and the NRC's parent guarantee mandates that no excessive costs as a result of decommissioning can be passed on to consumers and ratepayers. Okay, last conclusions, takeaways, and some remaining challenges. So in this talk, I aim to offer an overview, and by no means exhaustive, overview of the unique life cycle of the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant, and try to answer, and how by understanding the regional economic, political, and environmental factors, we could try to answer the question, why did Unit 1 close now? I discussed actions with which ultimately could not prevent its premature closure, as well as its unique position as a result of the 1979 partial meltdown and the organized anti-nuclear activism it spurred. Lastly, I described the current state of the TMI plant, particularly Unit 2's early stages of decommissioning and the timelines for decommissioning processes of both units. So based on the work that I've done so far, I've found a number of general key takeaways, questions, and challenges that still remain. Speaking strictly in financial definitions of cost often fails to capture the environmental, labor, community, or political cost to shuttering a nuclear plant. In TMI's case, the cost for closure was primarily market-driven according to Exelon, but examining arguments for keeping it open uncovers hidden costs and potential unintended consequences of the permanent shutdown. How we weigh these costs against one another is a crucial conversation for navigating a broader energy transition. Second, the responsibility of energy management is a confluence of federal, state, and local governments and their policies, shaped by dynamics of a public-private partnership. In Exelon's TMI closure announcement, they pointed to policy reforms to save TMI, but is saving a power plant entirely the responsibility of the state legislature? How should PJM reconsider their capacity market rules? And if decommissioning wasn't an affordable option, would Exelon have continued to keep Unit 1 running, no matter the price? Closure is an irreversible consequence, and it is near impossible to account for the toll of the decision regarding number of jobs, local economic impact, as well as the loss of potential future opportunities. The rise of fracking and the decision to shutter a nuclear plant bring up questions about disruption, innovation, and maintenance, and where we draw the lines between taking care of what we've built versus starting anew. On what grounds is maintenance no longer justifiable, especially in a nuclear energy context? And lastly, questions remain about short-term and long-term planning for our energy needs. As I mentioned earlier, the Nuclear Caucus report noted, we make long-term energy policy decisions based only on what is cheap today. Nuclear plants are built and licensed to last for decades. For a market structure that values what's cheap now, can traditional commercial nuclear power plants compete? Or will small modular reactors and other advanced reactor technologies solve this problem? I think these kinds of questions still remain highly debated. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak about this. And this talk, as with all my work related to TMI, is in honor of my dad, who worked at the nuclear plant for more than 30 years, and to my home, the community surrounding it. I'm happy to take any questions. I'm still learning, and I'm looking forward to learning from the audience too. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Hannah. That was fascinating. I admit I did not actually know that 3 Mile Island was being decommissioned at the moment. So it's a really interesting look into kind of the process of how that's happening. So if anybody out there has questions for Hannah, you can leave them in the chat and we will pass them on, or you can email us at lunchtimelectures@sciencehistory.org. I'm actually going to start off with a question from the email from our own Roger Turner. Roger asks, we know that coal and fracking companies are often good at dodging cleanup and well capping responsibilities. What about nuclear? What happens if a decommissioning company or the owners of the plant go out of business? Are there any policies in place to help ensure that the decommissioning actually happens?
That's a really good question. I think as far as what I know, I think it's kind of a structure, whereas the company ultimately takes responsibility for decommissioning. That's as much as I can answer. So if there were, like I've thought about before, yeah, if it would go over budget or if it would be completed earlier and under budget, which is their goal and tentative plan as of now, they are ultimately responsible for the decommissioning. However, that is a really good question, and I don't think I can answer it fully. But yeah, as far as they are responsible for the process. So yeah, but that's a really good question.
All right. We have a question in the chat from Robert Davidson. Asks, is there yet any consensus about the effect of the closing on energy resilience?
Yeah, that's a good question too. I don't think, so it seems to me like there's not really much of a consensus on different kinds of aspects of this closure. As I've been reading and learning more, I think, let me think, sorry. I think it's difficult to say, I'm sorry. I think that it's tricky because I'm not exactly sure the extent to which, like, yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not sure how to best answer it. I don't think there's, I would just say I don't think that there's a consensus as of now. So.
If you don't know of a consensus, that's actually probably a pretty good sign that there's not a robust one out there, which does actually answer the question. Yeah. All right, another one from the chat, Joanna Behrman asks, I was wondering if you could talk more about how different groups are looking at issues on different timescales. Are there ways to bring these different interest groups together?
Yeah, that's another really good question.
Yeah, if I could just kind of add to that a little bit. I mean, that was something that I had kind of flagged a little bit in your talk also, that we're talking about cheapness now versus cheapness over the long haul. Impact now versus impact over the long haul. And really, I mean, you don't get much more long haul than nuclear, and you really don't get much more short term than fossil fuels. So it's a really interesting dichotomy. Yeah.
Yeah, I think kind of the more that I read and the more that I learned about it, that's something that has really been stuck with me and been a focus of what I've been trying to learn about it, in terms of especially answering the question, why now? And I think that, the aspect of time frame and competition over that scale is really kind of really restructuring what especially our energy looks like in Pennsylvania in particular, like I said, with the injection of natural gas, especially over the last decade. So I think in terms of parsing through different interests, that's also a challenge that I've tried to work through as I'm learning about this, and that especially when you think about the political arguments and the legislative action, if you have groups of union workers for the plant, if you have the coalition of environmental voters in Pennsylvania, I think for me, still a very fundamental question with all of it that I'm still trying to very honestly parse through is, how does nuclear move forward at the intersection of all these things, and why, in some ways, is it that nuclear nuclear's changing role really seems to be at risk given these different kinds of interests, and can we reconcile them in a way that is just, which there are plenty of people talking about and doing amazing work on now, but I think it's very much a question for me as well. And so, yeah.
Yeah, I have a question that kind of expands on that a little bit. I mean, obviously, we're talking about 3 Mile Island, which we probably could not be talking about a more iconic or loaded with baggage nuclear power plant, but we could consider any other power plant versus fracking in Pennsylvania, for instance, just to use this very narrow example. And it seems like the political support, I don't know about public support. I don't know that fracking really has great reputation environmentally either on a public scale. But as far as political support, we see this huge differential. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what you see as being the sources of that. Specifically, I'm curious, based on a little of your earlier work, whether you see a differential in effective science communication, or whether just the science takes a back seat to the immediate economic interest, the long-term economic interests. How do you see all that folding together?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. So a couple different things. I think, and for me in my own experience, it's something I'm always trying to weigh in the way that I approach this and read about this, because for me and personally, my dad worked at the plant for his whole career, and I very much see the existence of 3MI as something that was beneficial. However, my mom lived in the area during the accident, and I've frequently heard that story growing up, and I can understand from what I've read these lasting feelings of mistrust for an institution that, or just a company that very much failed local residents in terms of accurate communication in the midst of and the aftermath of the accident. And I personally can see how those feelings really have lingered in different ways in my various interactions just with people I know in the community and how people talk about it. And a lot of those feelings, especially with miscommunication, have come up recently as through my participation in the Unit 2 Community Advisory Panel. We are tasked and charged with sort of acting as a bridge between, the company that is doing the decommissioning and the community in order to try to, just be better about communicating what's going on, the impact that they could see, and just so they're aware of these things. And I think it's tricky. I think that there are, for some, still some very deep held feelings about 3 Mile Island in particular nearby. And like I said, there's also some people who very much are grieving its loss. And, but I do think though that there is a lot in the middle as well. There is a Franklin and Marshall College Center for Public Opinion Research. One of their findings in March 2019, I think that was towards when the plant was getting ready to shut down. I think they were polling about people's opinions regarding adding nuclear to the Alternative Energy Portfolio Standard Act. And they found that there was about 50% support and about 50% oppose and not sure. So I think with nuclear, it's also important to remember that I think that there were kind of pretty vocal people on both sides, but I think I would think that I would feel comfortable saying that I think most people see it as like generally something to have and as part of our diverse energy portfolio, and especially with the long history and the unique history, whether contentious or not, as TMI being part of that, but nuclear in Pennsylvania and Pennsylvania being such a major player in the nuclear industry more broadly. So yeah.
So kind of piggybacking off of that, we have one more question in the chat, which I think we have time to end on this question because I think it's a great one. Joanna Behrman asks, you mentioned that there was lasting distress after the accident. What are the lessons we could take away for future science communication about disasters, and specifically the long term? Because right now we're talking about 30-year, 40-year effects of science communication. So what lessons can we carry forward from this?
Yeah, I think for me, and what I've first tried to practice and is really important is acknowledging and respecting the legitimacy of these lasting feelings of mistrust. And I think that really owning that and acknowledging that is a really important aspect of working to create a more open and like just better relationship between this nuclear institution and the public immediately surrounding it. For me, I think also communicating, there are things generally in terms of crisis communications, like effective messaging, saying the same message over and over again. I think there is power in saying, I don't know, like, and what are the questions I just tried to answer? I think that there's, I would never, not pretending to, or at least communicating something that is unclear, that you're uncertain about. I think there's still a large, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of just explaining what it is the nuclear plant does, what it has done, the role that all the positives that it has contributed to the community, and the clean energy that I think is not worth writing off, or not shouldn't be written off, especially in the context of TMI, which the accident very much has overshadowed the plant's legacy. But I do think that it's important to recognize all the positive work that was done there as well. And I think there's a realistic balance. And I think that for me, that's really important as I approach this kind of work, is acknowledging the legitimacy of how that could have felt and how that has lasted for people, and how it has shaped their mistrust of TMI and nuclear power writ large. And I think overcoming that is, there's still a lot of work to be done. So.
All right, we did have one last minute question come into the chat. So if you have just a couple more minutes to answer one more question. Scott Seaworth points out that in addition, today is 2 days after the 35th anniversary of the Chernobyl disaster. How do we factor in the potential for massive disaster in these cost-benefit analyses? And I guess in whatever angle you could speak to, whether it's political decisions or scientific decisions or just public opinion.
Yeah, that is an excellent question. And I am still trying to parse through, it's so fascinating to me to think about the ways in which we calculate risk, and in terms of, I guess, quantitatively, but also our perceptions of risk, which unfortunately, or whatever, the pandemic has really highlighted for a lot of people, is the ways in which we think about risk and how we understand that as part of, specifically with nuclear. I think it's been kind of very interesting to see. For 3 Mile Island is usually kind of grouped in with Chernobyl and Fukushima a lot, although I think that has done a bit of a disservice, again, not to kind of minimize the impact of the accident, although it was just different. It was different, the impact in the emotional and mental stress, and as far as that lack of communication. I think that really the challenge is in that risk communication. And I think there are also aspects of it too, from what I understand, but can't speak as well to, in terms of just the design of the plant. And I guess that is something, mitigating these kinds of risk is what I understand part of small modular reactors and their designs are trying to do. So just literally building them so much smaller in order to trying to prevent or mitigate these kinds of large scale potential consequences of just the ways that these commercial nuclear power plants used to be built. So I think both with emerging technologies as well as overcoming challenges and really thinking critically about how we calculate risk for ourselves and with these kinds of energy sources, I think a mix of that will be how we reconcile it. So if that answers your question.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. This was fascinating. I look forward to seeing future work on this, and I will be following this in the news now.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hannah, again. This talk has been the first of 6 in this spring series. We are streaming this season on Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Eastern. For the full spring schedule, please visit sciencehistory.org/lunchtime-lectures. For the second talk in the series in 2 weeks, we will be joined by Ashanti Shi, who will speak about botany, ecology, and personal relationships in interwar Hawaii. You can join us for that talk on Wednesday, May the 12th at 1 o'clock Eastern. For more from the Science History Institute, including updates on all our virtual programs and events, you can follow us online. We are at scihistory.org on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Thank you all for joining us. Thanks again to Hannah, and everyone have a great day. We'll see you next time.